December 1876. Will Bridger found her half-frozen in a snowbank 12 miles from anywhere, a bullet wound in her shoulder and 3 dead vigilantes in her wake. She was 63 years old, Apache, and she wasn't asking for mercy. She was demanding a horse. The morning had started like any other December morning in the mountains west of South Pass City, Wyoming territory. Will was checking his trap line, the kind of monotonous work that kept a 70-year-old man moving when the alternative was sitting in a cabin waiting to die. The sky hung low and gray, pregnant with the promise of more snow. His breath came out in white clouds that disappeared into the cold air. His hands, gnarled and spotted with age, worked the traps with the efficiency of 5 decades of practice. He was a mountain man, had been since 1824, when he'd left Virginia at 18 with nothing but a rifle and the kind of restlessness that drove young men west. He'd trapped beaver, fought grizzlies, survived 3 arrow wounds, 2 knife fights, and a winter so cold his partner had lost all his toes to frostbite. He'd married Eleanor in 1835, an Irish girl with red hair and a spirit that matched the wild country. They'd built the cabin with their own hands, raised their son Daniel in it, and watched the wilderness slowly give way to settlements and civilization. Eleanor had died of plague 8 years ago, the kind that swept through the scattered settlements, taking the old and the weak without mercy. Will had nursed her for 2 weeks, watching helplessly as the fever consumed her. On the last day, she'd held his hand and told him she loved him. Then she was gone, and the cabin that had been full of life became a tomb of memories. Daniel had moved to California in 1865 with his wife Margaret. They wrote twice a year dutiful letters that said everything and nothing. The grandchildren were growing. The farm was doing well. They hoped he was staying warm, standard fare for a son who'd built his own life 1,000 miles away. So Will lived alone. He checked his traps. He sold furs in town once a month. He kept the cabin clean because Eleanor would have wanted it that way, and he waited not unhappily for his own end to come. That's when he heard the gunshots. 3 sharp cracks that echoed off the mountains and sent a flock of ravens screaming into the sky. Will stopped his hand automatically, going to the rifle slung across his back. Gunfire in these mountains usually meant trouble. Hunters didn't shoot 3 times in quick succession like that. Those were combat shots. He stood still, listening. The wind carried no more sounds except its own howling through the pines. But something pulled at him, some instinct honed by decades of surviving in places where hesitation meant death. He turned his horse toward the sound and rode. 20 minutes later he found them. 3 bodies in the snow. Men, or what used to be men. They lay sprawled in the attitudes of violent death, dark blood staining the white powder around them. Will dismounted carefully, rifle-ready eyes scanning the tree line. The bodies were fresh. Steam still rose from the blood. He examined them without touching. All 3 had been shot. Clean shots, center mass. Whoever had killed them knew how to handle a rifle. One man's horse stood nearby, reins trailing too well trained to bolt. The other horses were gone. Will's eyes caught the trail. Boot prints smaller than a man's heading deeper into the forest. And beside them, darker spots in the snow. Blood drops irregular and telling. Someone was wounded and on foot. He followed the trail. 200 yards into the timber, he found her. She sat with her back against a massive ponderosa pine, a rifle across her lap, her fingers still on the trigger. Her left shoulder was dark with blood, the buckskin shirt torn where a bullet had passed through. Her face was the color of old leather, weathered by sun and wind, lined with 63 years of living. Her hair, more gray than black, hung in a long braid over her good shoulder. Her lips had taken on the blue-purple tinge of hypothermia, but her eyes were alert, dark and fierce, and watching him with the wariness of a cornered animal that still had teeth. Will raised his hands slowly, showing he was no threat. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm not with them." She said nothing. Her fingers stayed on the trigger. "Those men back there," Will continued, his voice calm and even, "they're dead. You're shot. And if that wound doesn't kill you, the cold will. You've got maybe an hour before the frostbite in your feet becomes permanent. Not your concern." Her voice came out rough, accented, but clear. English learned from someone patient enough to teach it right. "Can't leave a woman to freeze," Will said. "Not in my nature." "I killed 3 men." She watched him with those fierce eyes. "You know what that makes me?" "Alive," Will said simply. "That's all that matters right now." She studied him. Will could see her calculating weighing options that probably all looked bad. Her face was tight with pain. The blood on her shoulder had started to freeze in the bitter air. Her feet, he noticed, were wrapped in cloth and hide that had once been moccasins, but were now soaked through. "Give me your horse," she said finally. "I'll leave you the rifle." Will almost smiled. Even dying, she was bargaining from a position she didn't have. "You'll die in an hour," he said again. "Maybe less. That shoulder needs tending and you need to get warm. I've got a cabin, 2 hours ride. I'll patch you up, give you supplies. You leave when the storm clears. Deal." "Why?" The question came out flat, suspicious. "Because I'm 70 years old and I've buried enough people. Don't need another grave on my conscience." They looked at each other across the snow. 2 old people who'd survived too much to die easy. Will saw the moment she made her decision. It was in the slight relaxation of her shoulders, the way her finger eased off the trigger. "I pay my debts," she said. "I'll work for the supplies." Will nodded. He moved slowly, telegraphing every motion as he approached. Up close he could see the wound better, through and through, which was lucky. The bullet had passed clean without hitting bone. But she'd lost blood, and the cold was doing its work. "This is going to hurt," he warned. "Everything hurts," she said. "Get on with it." He helped her stand. She swayed, and he caught her with an arm around her waist. She was lighter than he expected, all wire and bone. But when she gripped his arm to steady herself, the strength in her hand surprised him. Getting her onto the horse took effort. She was weak from blood loss and cold, and twice she nearly fainted. But she gritted her teeth and pushed through, and Will respected that. He'd known men who would have given up by now. He swung up behind her, reaching around to hold the reins. She stiffened at the contact. "Easy," he said quietly. "Just keeping you from falling." She said nothing, but he felt some of the tension leave her back. They rode. The sky opened up 20 minutes into the journey. Snow began falling in thick, heavy flakes that cut visibility to almost nothing. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees. Will felt the woman sag against him, unconscious or close to it. He tightened his arm around her waist and urged the horse faster. The wind picked up, howling like something alive and hungry. Will navigated by memory and instinct, trusting his sense of direction and the horse's training. Twice the woman stirred, mumbling words in a language he didn't understand. Apache, probably. He'd heard it before years ago, in the wild days when the territories were still contested ground. "Stay with me," he murmured. "Cabin's close." She didn't respond. The storm intensified. Will couldn't see 10 feet ahead, but the horse kept moving, and Will kept his bearings, and finally, like a miracle emerging from white chaos, he saw the dark shape of his cabin. He dismounted in the small lean-to shelter he'd built for the horse, pulling the woman down after him. She was barely conscious now, her skin cold to the touch. He half carried, half dragged her to the cabin door, kicked it open, and brought her inside. The interior was dim and cold. Will laid her on the bed near the fireplace, the only bed in the one-room cabin. He worked fast, stripping off her wet outer clothes, wrapping her in every blanket he owned. Then he turned to the fireplace and built a fire, coaxing flames from kindling with hands that shook slightly from cold and urgency. The fire caught. Heat began spreading through the small space. Will turned back to the woman. Her breathing was shallow but steady. He heated water, gathered his medical supplies, such as they were, and set to work. The wound was ugly, but clean. He washed it thoroughly, watching her face twitch with pain even in her semi-conscious state. Then came the hard part. 12 stitches with a needle and thread pulling torn flesh back together. She woke during the 6th stitch, her eyes flying open, her hand grabbing his wrist with surprising strength. "Easy," Will said. "Almost done." She looked at him, looked at what he was doing, then looked away. She didn't cry out, didn't make a sound, just stared at the cabin wall and let him finish. "You got grit, ma'am," Will said, as he tied off the last stitch. "Most men would have screamed." She turned her head to look at him. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "I've birthed a child in a wagon," she said. "This is nothing." Will bandaged the wound carefully, then checked her feet. Frostbite, but not severe. She'd been lucky there too. Or tough. Probably both. When he was finished, he stepped back. She watched him with those dark, evaluating eyes. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You're welcome," Will replied. "I'm Will Bridger. This is my cabin." "Ayita," she said. "Ayita Swiftwater." The name was Apache, the kind that spoke of identity and heritage. Will nodded, filing it away. "You hungry, Ayita?" She considered, then nodded. Will went to his small store of provisions and began preparing soup. Venison, dried vegetables, water from the pump. Simple fare, but hot and nourishing. While it cooked, he set about making the cabin more comfortable. He moved his bedroll to the floor near the fire, giving her the bed without comment. He brought in more wood. He stoked the fire higher. Ayita watched him move around the space. Her eyes took in everything, the sparse but clean interior, the rifle mounted on the wall, the animal hide stretched for curing, the tools arranged with military precision, and on a small shelf near the bed a photograph in a wooden frame, a younger version of Will standing beside a woman with red hair and a kind smile. "Your wife?" Ayita asked. Will glanced at the photograph. "Eleanor. She died 8 years ago. Plague. I'm sorry." Will ladled soup into a bowl and brought it to her. "And you mentioned a child." Ayita took the bowl carefully. Her hands trembled slightly, whether from cold or weakness or emotion Will couldn't tell. "I was married," she said. 44 years. My husband Samuel died 2 years ago. Fever. Our son Jacob died before that. Mining accident in Colorado. He was 42. Will sat on the edge of the rough wooden table, his own bowl of soup warming his hands. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. They ate in silence. It was a comfortable silence, the kind shared by people who understood that some griefs were too deep for words. When Ayita finished, exhaustion claimed her. Her eyes began to close despite her efforts to stay awake. Will took the bowl gently from her hands. "Sleep," he said. "You're safe here." "Those men," she murmured, already half asleep. "They'll have friends." "I know," Will said. "We'll deal with that when you're stronger." She wanted to argue, he could see it in the way her brow furrowed, but sleep won. Her breathing deepened and evened out. Will sat by the fire and watched her sleep. Outside, the storm howled like something trying to get in. Inside, the fire crackled and popped. And on the bed, a woman he'd known for less than 3 hours slept with the kind of exhausted vulnerability that comes from surviving something that should have killed you. Will thought about the 3 dead men. Thought about the kind of men who would hunt a woman through a winter storm. Vigilantes, probably. The kind who'd been causing trouble since the wars with the Sioux and Cheyenne had ended. They saw anyone with dark skin as the enemy, didn't matter if they were Lakota or Apache or Mexican. Justice to them meant violence, and they wrapped it in the flag and called it patriotism. He'd seen their type before, fought them before, back when the territories were lawless and a man's word and his rifle were all that stood between civilization and chaos. He didn't like them then, and he didn't like them now. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, he had a woman to keep alive. Around midnight, Ayita's fever spiked. She began to toss and turn, murmuring in her sleep. Words in Apache mixed with names in English. Jacob, Samuel, Sarah. The fever dream language of someone reliving loss. Will dampened a cloth in cool water and placed it on her forehead. Her skin burned under his touch. He changed the cloth every few minutes, fighting the fever the only way he knew how. "You're safe," he murmured, not sure if she could hear him. "I got you." Her hand shot out, gripping his wrist. Her eyes opened, unfocused and glassy with fever. "Don't leave," she whispered in English. "Everyone leaves." "I'm here," Will said. "I'm not going anywhere." She held his wrist for another moment, then her grip loosened. She sank back into restless sleep. Will stayed beside the bed all night. His knees ached from sitting on the hard floor. His back protested the awkward position. At 70, the body didn't forgive discomfort the way it used to. But he stayed anyway, changing the cloth, monitoring her breathing, keeping watch over a stranger who'd stumbled into his life with a bullet wound and the kind of fierce dignity he recognized. By dawn, the fever broke. Aida's breathing eased, the lines of pain on her face smoothed out. Will finally allowed himself to relax, slumping against the side of the bed, his head dropping to his chest. He dozed. Not deep sleep, but the light rest of a man trained to wake at the slightest sound. When his eyes opened again, pale winter light was filtering through the cabin's small window. Aida was awake. She lay very still, watching him with those dark eyes. "You stayed," she said. "Said I would," Will replied. She studied his face. He let her look too tired to put up any kind of front. What she saw was a 70-year-old man with more wrinkles than smooth skin, hair the color of iron, and eyes that had seen too much and forgotten too little. "Why?" she asked. It seemed to be her favorite question. Will considered. In the growing light he could see her more clearly, the strong bones of her face, the silver threading through her black hair, the way she held herself with dignity, even lying wounded in a stranger's bed. "I've been alone 8 years," he said finally. "In all that time I haven't talked to anyone more than I had to. Go to town once a month, sell furs, buy supplies, come home. That's it. That's my whole life now." He paused, surprised at himself for saying even that much. "Last night," he continued, "taking care of you, having someone else in this cabin even sick and fevered and half dead, it reminded me what it felt like when this place was a home instead of just a structure to keep the snow out." Aida said nothing for a long moment. "I had a sister," she said finally. "Sarah. Full Apache. I'm only half. My father was a French-Canadian trader. Sarah died a month ago. Fever. The reservation wouldn't let me stay after she passed. Said I wasn't Apache enough." "Where were you going?" "Nowhere," Aida said simply. "Just away." They looked at each other in the dawn light. Two people at the end of their roads with nothing behind them but graves and nothing ahead but uncertainty. "The storm's gonna break today or tomorrow," Will said. "When it does, you can leave if you want. I'll give you supplies enough to get you somewhere. Or," he hesitated, then committed, "you can stay. Long as you need. No debt, just company." Aida's eyes widened slightly. It was the first crack in her composure he'd seen. "You don't know me," she whispered. "No, ma'am, I don't," Will agreed. "But I know loneliness when I see it. I've been living with it long enough to recognize its face, and I know that life is shorter than we think it is when we're young, and that the years we have left are precious." He stood slowly, his joints protesting, walked to the window, and looked out at the snow-covered world. "Spending them alone when you don't have to," he finished, "seems like a waste of whatever time God has given us." Behind him, he heard Aida shift on the bed. When he turned back, she was sitting up, despite the pain it clearly caused her. "I'll stay a week," she said, "until I'm healed enough to travel. I'll work for my keep, and then I'll decide." Will nodded. It was more than he'd expected and less than he'd hoped for, but it was a start. Outside, the storm howled. Inside, two strangers who'd outlived everyone they loved sat in fragile silence. Neither knew that in 7 days they would face a choice that would change both their lives. Neither knew that running from the men hunting her or standing together to fight would become the defining question of whatever years they had left. All they knew was this moment, this cabin, this temporary truce against the loneliness that had been eating them both alive. And for now, that was enough. The first morning of their arrangement began before dawn. Will woke to find Aida already up, sitting on the edge of the bed with her good hand gripping the bedpost, clearly trying to work up the courage to stand. "You need rest," Will said from his bedroll by the fire. "I said I'd work." Her voice was firm despite the pain lines around her mouth. "I keep my word." Will recognized that tone. It was the sound of pride, the kind that couldn't be bent even when the body was broken. He'd heard it in his own voice often enough over the years. "How about this?" he said, sitting up and reaching for his boots. "You handle what you can do sitting down. I'll handle the rest. That way you're working, but you're also healing. Fair?" Aida considered this. Finally she nodded. They fell into a rhythm over the next few days. Will rose at 5 as he had for 50 years, and went out to check on the horse, bring in firewood, and see to the necessities of survival in a Wyoming winter. Aida woke at 6 and insisted on making herself useful. She couldn't do heavy work with her shoulder, but she could cook, and she could mend, and she could tell Will which of the herbs hanging from his rafters would help with inflammation and which would fight infection. The first time she made fry bread, Will watched with curiosity. She mixed flour and water and a pinch of salt with her good hand, kneading the dough against the table edge. Then she heated fat in his cast-iron skillet and dropped in rounds of dough that puffed and browned. "What's this called?" Will asked when she handed him a piece still hot. "Fry bread. My mother taught me before she died. Apache recipe, but adapted for what we could get on the frontier." Will bit into it. The outside was crispy, the inside soft and slightly chewy. It was simple food, but there was something about it that spoke of care and tradition and hands passing down knowledge through generations. "It's good," he said. Aida smiled. It was a small smile, tentative, like she wasn't sure she remembered how, but it transformed her face, softening the hard lines that pain and loss had carved there. "Your wife," Aida said, settling carefully into the chair across from him. "She cooked different—" "Irish stew," Will said. "Potatoes every night for 30 years. Took her 5 years to learn how to cook them without burning, but once she figured it out, that's all she wanted to make. She grew up in Ireland during the famine, came over when she was 16. Never could get enough potatoes after that, like she was making up for all the years she went without." They ate in companionable silence. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the world, but inside the cabin, warmth and the smell of fresh bread created a pocket of peace. On the third day, Will brought in a hide that needed curing. He'd been putting it off, the tedious work of scraping and stretching, not high on his list of priorities when he was alone. But now he had someone to share the work with. Aida took one look at the hide and nodded. "I can do this." Will watched as she set to work with his scraping tools. Her movements were precise and practiced the motions so ingrained that even her injured shoulder didn't slow her much. She worked the hide with a knowledge that spoke of years, maybe decades of doing this exact task. "Where'd you learn that?" Will asked. "My people," Aida said without looking up, "and my husband. Samuel was a trader. Taught me how the white men wanted the hides prepared. Different from Apache way, but both work." Will pulled up a stool and began helping, following her lead. They worked side by side, and Will found himself noticing small things. The way she hummed quietly while she worked a tune with no melody he recognized. The way her braid fell forward over her good shoulder. The competence in her hands despite the pain she must be feeling. "You're good at this," he said after a while. "I've been doing it 60 years, Aida replied. "Started when I was 3. Mother put a scraper in my hand and said if I wanted to eat I had to work. Apache don't believe in idle children." Will thought about his own childhood in Virginia, where work had been just as expected but looked very different. Plowing fields, chopping wood, the endless labor of a frontier farm, different cultures, different places, but the same fundamental truth: survival required effort. By the 4th day, Aida was moving around the cabin with more ease. Her shoulder was healing well, the stitches holding the infection that Will had worried about never materializing. She'd been checking the wound herself, changing the bandages with a clinical efficiency that spoke of experience with injuries. That afternoon, Will developed a cough. It started small, just a tickle in his throat, but by evening it had settled into his chest, deep and rattling. He tried to hide it, but Aida noticed everything. "How long have you had that?" she asked. "It's nothing. Winter cough. Happens every year." Aida stood and went to the herbs hanging from the rafters. She selected several bunches with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. "Sit," she ordered. Will sat. She brewed a tea from the herbs, something that smelled sharp and medicinal. When she handed him the cup, he looked at it dubiously. "Drink," she said. "All of it." It tasted as bad as it smelled, bitter and astringent. But Will drank it down because she was watching him with those fierce eyes that dared him to refuse. By the next morning the cough was gone. Not improved. Gone. "What was in that?" Will asked. "Sage, mullein, elderberry, Apache medicine. Your people call it folk remedy, but it works better than anything your doctors prescribe." Will looked at her with new respect. "You're a healer." "I know plants," Aida corrected. "My grandmother taught me. Said a woman who knows how to heal will never be useless even when she's old." "Your grandmother was a wise woman." "She was. Lived to be 90. Died in her sleep after teaching a young girl how to set a broken bone. Said she was ready, that she'd passed on what she needed to pass on." There was something wistful in Aida's voice, a longing for that kind of purposeful ending. Will understood. At 70, he thought about death more than he liked to admit. Not with fear, but with a kind of curious anticipation. What would it be like? Would Eleanor be waiting? Would it hurt? Or would it be like falling asleep? On the 5th day they heard riders. Will was outside chopping wood when the sound of hoofbeats reached him. 3 horses moving slow like men searching for something. He set down the axe and moved quietly to the cabin door. "Aita," he said, keeping his voice low. "We've got company." She was on her feet, immediately moving to the window. Together they watched as 3 riders passed on the trail about 100 yards from the cabin. They didn't stop, didn't even seem to notice the cabin tucked back in the trees. But the way they were moving, the way they were looking around, made their purpose clear. "They're looking for me," Aida said. "How do you know?" "Because I know what hunting looks like. I've seen it enough times." They watched until the riders disappeared around a bend in the trail. Will waited another 10 minutes before going back outside to finish with the wood. When he came back in, Aida was sitting at the table, her hands folded in front of her. "I should go," she said, "before I bring trouble to your door. You said you'd stay a week. That was before I knew they were still searching." Will sat down across from her. "Aida, I've lived in these mountains for 40 years. I've dealt with bears, mountain lions, hostile Indians, back when this was all contested territory, and winters that would freeze a man solid if he made one wrong step. 3 vigilantes don't scare me." "They should," Aida said quietly. "These aren't honorable men. They're the kind who kill for sport and call it justice." "I know the type," Will said, "and I know this too. You run now, you'll be running forever. Wounded alone in winter. You won't make it. Better that than getting you killed." Will leaned back in his chair. "That's not your choice to make. This is my cabin, my decision. And I'm saying, you stay until you're healed and until we figure out what to do about those men." They sat in silence, wills colliding across the rough wooden table. Finally Aida nodded, but her face was troubled. That evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, the silence between them felt different, heavier, weighted with things unsaid. "Tell me about your husband," Will said finally. "Samuel." Aida looked surprised by the question. Then her face softened in a way Will hadn't seen before. "We married when I was 17. My father arranged it. I was terrified. Samuel was white and I was Apache. I thought he would treat me like a servant or worse. But he was kind." She stared into the fire, seeing something far beyond the flames. "He learned to speak Apache so he could talk to my mother. When people in town would say cruel things about me, he would stand between us and them, literally put his body between me and their hate. He wasn't a violent man, but he would have fought for me. I know that. He sounds like a good man. He was. Not perfect. He drank too much sometimes. He had a temper when he thought he was being cheated in a trade. But he loved me. Truly loved me. And when he died holding my hand and telling me I was the best thing that ever happened to him, I believed him. Will nodded. Eleanor was like that. Not perfect, but real. She couldn't cook worth a damn when we married. Burned everything. But she kept trying, and after about 5 years she figured it out. Aida smiled. What else? She sang. Irish songs, mostly ones her mother taught her. I didn't understand half the words, but it didn't matter. The sound of her voice in the cabin made it feel like home. Do you still love her? The question was direct, almost challenging. Will met Aida's eyes. Yes, he said honestly. I'll always love her, but she's gone, and I'm still here. I've learned that you can love someone who's dead and still have room for the living. Aida absorbed this. I think Samuel would have liked you. I think Eleanor would have liked you too. They sat together as the fire burned down to embers, two people who'd loved and lost, finding unexpected comfort in shared grief. On the 6th day the storm finally broke. Will woke to silence, the kind of profound quiet that only comes after days of howling wind. He went to the window and looked out at a world transformed. The snow had stopped. The sky was that brilliant blue that only exists in winter at high altitude. The sun blazed off the snow, almost blinding in its intensity. It was beautiful, and it meant Aida could leave if she wanted to. Will made coffee and tried not to think about the emptiness that would fill the cabin when she was gone. He'd gotten used to her presence, the sound of another person breathing, the smell of fry bread in the morning, the quiet conversations by the fire. He'd been alone for 8 years. 7 days with Aida had reminded him what he'd been missing. When Aida woke, she went immediately to the window. She stood there for a long time, looking at the clear sky and the passable trail. Storm's over, she said. Yes. She turned to face him. Will I need to tell you something? He waited. That night when those men attacked me, I wasn't just wandering. I was going to South Pass City. I had $17 in the name of a woman who might give me work cleaning her boarding house. That was my plan. Get work, save money, maybe head east in the spring to somewhere I'm not known. And now I don't know. Those men are still out there. If I go to South Pass City, they'll find me. And even if they don't, I'm Apache. A boarding house won't hire me to clean. A store won't sell to me without charging double. I'll be lucky if they don't run me out of town the first day. Will set down his coffee cup. What he was about to say was crazy. He knew it was crazy, but he said it anyway. Then don't go to South Pass City. Stay here. I can't impose on you forever. I'm not talking about imposing. Will took a breath. Aida, I'm 70 years old. I don't have time to dance around things or be polite about what I want. So I'm going to say this straight. Stay, not as a guest. As my wife. The silence that followed was absolute. Aida stared at him like he'd grown a second head. What? Marry me, Will said. I know it sounds crazy. We barely know each other. But I'm 70. I don't have time to court you for a year. And the truth is, these past 7 days having you here, it's been the most alive I've felt since Eleanor died. Aida shook her head. You feel sorry for me? No. Will's voice was firm. I respect you. There's a difference. You're strong. You're capable. You're real in a way most people aren't. And if you leave, I'll go back to being alone in this cabin waiting to die. I don't want that anymore. What are you really offering? Aida's voice was careful, guarded. Shelter, a place to hide. I'm offering a partnership, Will said. You work beside me. I protect you. We face whatever comes together. We keep each other company. and maybe if we're lucky we find something worth living for in whatever years we have left. The town will hate it. You'll make enemies. I haven't cared what the town thinks in 8 years, not about to start now. Your son will think you've lost your mind. Daniel's 40 years old with his own life in California. This is my choice, not his. Those vigilantes will keep hunting me. Then we'll handle them, together. Aida walked to the window again. She stood with her back to him, and Will could see the tension in her shoulders the way her good hand gripped the window frame. I'm 63 years old, she said quietly. I'm Apache in a white world. I've got nothing to offer you except work and honesty. That's more than most marriages start with, Will said. She turned. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Why? She asked. That question again. The one she kept asking as if she couldn't quite believe someone would choose her. Will stood and crossed to her. He stopped a respectful distance away, giving her space. Because I've been alone long enough to know what it costs, he said. Because you remind me what it feels like to be needed. Because when I look at you I don't see someone who needs saving. I see someone who could stand beside me and make whatever time I have left mean something. He paused, then added quietly, because I think you're tired of being alone too. A single tear escaped and tracked down Aida's weathered cheek. She wiped it away impatiently. I won't be a servant, she said, or a convenience. I'm asking you to be my wife. That means equal, partner. I won't give up my Apache ways. I'll pray to my gods, not yours. I wouldn't ask you to. I won't pretend to be white to make anyone comfortable. Good. I like you the way you are. Aida searched his face. Will let her look, hiding nothing. What she saw was a man old enough to know his own mind offering something real in a world that had given her mostly illusions and disappointments. If I say yes, she said slowly, and those men come here, I'll fight beside you. I won't hide while you defend me. I'd expect nothing less. And if this doesn't work, if we find we can't live together, I want your word you'll let me go with supplies and no hard feelings. You have it. She took a deep breath, let it out slowly, looked at him one more time, really looked as if memorizing his face or searching for any hint of deception. She found none. Then yes, Aida Swiftwater said. I'll marry you, Will Bridger. They shook hands like business partners sealing a deal. Her grip was firm, callous, the hand of a woman who'd worked all her life. His was the same. Two old hands, scarred and weathered, clasping across the distance of cultures and circumstances and 7 days of shared solitude. We'll go to town tomorrow, Will said. Find the preacher. Make it legal. And if they refuse, then we live as we choose and let the law catch up when it feels like it. I don't need a piece of paper to keep my word. Aida nodded. Then, surprising them both, she leaned forward and kissed his cheek. It was brief, chaste, the kind of kiss you'd give a friend, but it carried weight, promise, commitment. When she stepped back, they both were smiling, slightly awkward and uncertain, and somehow hopeful. That night they sat by the fire longer than usual. Neither wanted to sleep yet, as if sleeping would break the spell of what had happened. They talked about practical things, what they'd need from town, how they'd handle the preacher's questions, what they'd say if people objected. Big Mark Keller runs the saloon in South Pass City, Will said. He's also the one who organized most of the vigilante activity in the area. If those men who attacked you were his, he'll cause trouble. Can you handle him? I can handle most men with words, and if words don't work, I've still got my rifle and a memory of how to use it. I killed 3 of his men, Will. He won't forgive that. He shouldn't have sent them after a woman, Will said flatly. Play stupid games, win stupid prizes. Aida laughed, a real laugh that lit up her whole face. Where did you learn that saying? Made it up just now, but it fits, doesn't it? They talked until the fire burned low and exhaustion finally claimed them. Will gave Aida the bed again, taking his bedroll by the hearth. But before she lay down, she paused. Will, yes. Thank you. for seeing me when I was invisible." Will looked at her silhouetted against the dying firelight and felt something shift in his chest. Not love, not yet, but the potential for it, the space where it could grow. "Thank you for saying yes when you could have said no." She smiled and went to bed. Will lay on his bedroll staring at the ceiling beams he'd placed 40 years ago with Eleanor's help. Tomorrow they'd ride to town. Tomorrow they'd face whatever came. Tomorrow their lives would change in ways neither could predict. But tonight, for the first time in 8 years, Will Bridger didn't feel alone. And in the bed across the room, Aida Swiftwater, who'd walked into a winter storm expecting to die, closed her eyes and thought that maybe, just maybe, she'd found a reason to live. Outside, the Wyoming night was clear and cold and full of stars. The vigilantes who hunted Aida were regrouping, planning sharpening their hate. The town of South Pass City was sleeping, unaware that tomorrow 2 people would walk in and challenge everything it thought it knew about love and race and the right to choose your own path. But inside the cabin there was warmth. There was hope. There were 2 old souls who'd bet everything they had left on one last chance at not dying alone. And for now that was enough. The ride to South Pass City began at dawn. Will saddled both horses, giving Aida the gentler mare while he took his aging gelding. The sky was impossibly blue, the kind of winter morning that made everything look clean and new, like the world had been scrubbed overnight. Aida wore the best clothes she had, a buckskin dress that Samuel had bought her 20 years ago, still well made despite its age, and a wool coat that had seen better days. She'd braided her gray-streaked hair in the traditional Apache way, refusing to hide what she was. Her chin was up her shoulders back, but Will could see the tension in the way she held the reins. "You ready?" he asked. "No," she said honestly, "but I'll do it anyway." They rode side by side through 12 miles of winter landscape. The snow lay thick on the ground, unmarred except for animal tracks. Deer had passed through in the night. A mountain lion had crossed the trail about a mile from the cabin. An eagle circled overhead, riding thermals in the cold air. Will found himself watching Aida as much as the trail. She rode well, with the easy competence of someone who'd spent a lifetime on horseback. Her wounded shoulder seemed to be holding up, though he caught her wincing once or twice when the mare stumbled. "Your shoulder hurting?" he asked. "It's fine." "Aida." She glanced at him. "It aches, but it's healing. I've had worse." They rode in silence for a while. Then Will said, "When we get to town, people are going to stare. They're going to talk. Some might say things that aren't kind." "I know. I need you to let me handle it. Not because you can't, but because if you respond to every idiot who says something stupid, we'll never make it to the church." Aida's lips quirked in what might have been a smile. "I've been handling stupid men my whole life, Will. I know when to fight and when to ignore." "Good, because I'd rather not shoot anyone on my wedding day." This time she did smile. "That would be poor form." The closer they got to South Pass City, the more Aida's posture stiffened. Will understood. She was riding into a place that might see her as less than human, where her very presence could spark violence. It took courage. More courage than most people would ever need to summon. South Pass City appeared on the horizon around mid-morning. It wasn't much of a town, just a collection of wooden buildings clustered along a muddy main street. Gold had brought people here in the 60s, and when the gold played out, most had left. What remained was a stubborn population of miners, ranchers, and merchants too invested to quit. They rode down the main street at 10 in the morning. The street was nearly empty, most folks indoors away from the cold, but the few who were out stopped to stare. A man hauling water from the well let his bucket clatter back down. A woman stepping out of the general store pulled her child inside and shut the door. Will heard the whispers starting, saw the heads turning to track their progress. Aida sat straighter in her saddle, if that was possible. Her face was a mask, revealing nothing, but her hands on the reins were tight enough that her knuckles showed white. They rode to the small Methodist church at the edge of town. It was a simple building, whitewashed boards, and a modest steeple, the kind of church that served more as a community gathering place than a house of grand worship. Will dismounted and helped Aida down, though she clearly didn't need the help. It was a gesture, a statement for anyone watching. This woman is with me, and I treat her with respect. The church door was unlocked. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and candle wax. Reverend Josiah Webb was at the altar arranging hymnals. He looked up when they entered, and Will saw the moment of recognition followed by surprise. "Will Bridger," Webb said. He was a man in his mid-50s, balding, with the kind face of someone who genuinely believed in the goodness of people despite considerable evidence to the contrary. "Haven't seen you in months. I was beginning to think you'd become a hermit permanently." "Reverend," Will said, "this is Aida Swiftwater. We're here to get married." The silence that followed was profound. Webb's eyes went from Will to Aida and back again. To his credit, his expression didn't change to disgust or anger, just surprise. "Ma'am," he said, finally nodding to Aida. "Reverend," Aida replied. Webb set down the hymnals carefully. "Will, can I speak with you privately for a moment?" "Anything you need to say you can say in front of Aida. She's going to be my wife." Webb looked at them both, then sighed. "All right, come to my office." They followed him to a small room off the main sanctuary. Webb's wife, Clara, appeared from somewhere in the back of the church carrying a tray with tea. She was a handsome woman in her early 50s with kind eyes and silver threading through her dark hair. "I heard voices," Clara said, then stopped when she saw Aida. But unlike the people on the street, Clara's face lit up with something that looked like recognition. "Oh my, you're Apache, aren't you?" "Yes, ma'am," Aida said cautiously. "Sit down, please," Clara said, setting the tea down. "All of you. Josiah, don't just stand there looking shocked. Get chairs." They sat. Clara poured tea with the ease of someone who'd been doing it for decades, making sure everyone had a cup before settling into her own chair. "Now then," Clara said, "Will, you said you want to marry this woman?" "I did. I do." "And you, dear?" Clara turned to Aida. "You want to marry Will?" "Yes." Clara studied them both, her eyes sharp and assessing. Then she smiled. "Good. It's about time Will stopped living like a ghost." "Clara," Webb said, his voice holding a warning. "Oh, hush, Josiah. You've been worried about him for years. We both have." She turned to Aida. "What's your name, dear?" "Aida Swiftwater." "That's a beautiful name." "Aida. It means something, doesn't it?" "First to dance," Aida said quietly. "My mother named me that because I came out dancing, or so she said." Clara laughed, a warm, genuine sound. "I like that. I had an Apache friend once, many years ago. This was at Fort Defiance in New Mexico Territory. My father was stationed there and I was just a girl. Her name was Nayland. She taught me to make peaky bread and told me stories about Coyote the Trickster. She was the kindest person I ever met." Aida's posture relaxed fractionally. "What happened to her?" "She married a man from her tribe and moved north. I lost track of her after we left the fort. But I've never forgotten her kindness to a lonely white girl who didn't fit in." Webb cleared his throat. "Clara, we need to discuss the practical matters." "What's to discuss?" Clara said. "They want to marry. You're a minister. Marry them." "It's not that simple. The town, Clara. You know how people are." "I know how small-minded people are," Clara said sharply. "I also know that God doesn't care about the color of skin when two people want to make a commitment before Him." Webb looked pained. "I'm not objecting on theological grounds. I'm worried about what will happen after. Big Mark Keller has been stirring up trouble. Just last month there was an incident with the Cheyenne family. If Will marries an Apache woman, Mark will use it as an excuse." "An excuse for what?" Will asked, his voice hard. "You know what. Violence. He'll call you an Indian lover, say you've betrayed your own kind. He might come after you both." "Let him try," Will said. Aida spoke up, her voice quiet but firm. "Reverend Webb, I understand your concern. I've lived my whole life between two worlds. I know what hate looks like and I know the danger. But I also know that running from it doesn't make it go away. If Will wants to marry me and you're willing to perform the ceremony, then I'm willing to face whatever comes after." Webb looked at her, really looked, and Will saw respect dawn in the minister's eyes. "You understand what you're asking," Webb said. "This town has a short memory for kindness and a long one for grudges." "I understand," Aita said. "Do you?" The question hung in the air. Clara reached over and took her husband's hand. "Josiah," she said softly, "remember why we came west. Remember what you said when we left Boston. That out here on the frontier, we had a chance to live our faith instead of just preaching it." Webb closed his eyes. When he opened them, he nodded. "All right," he said. "I'll marry you, but we should do it now quickly before word spreads too far." "Thank you, Reverend," Will said. They were preparing to move to the sanctuary when the church door slammed open. Heavy footsteps echoed on the wooden floor, and a voice called out loud and aggressive, "Webb, you in here!" Will recognized the voice. Marcus Keller. Big Mark. The man who ran the saloon and fancied himself the town's guardian of moral purity, despite being drunk more often than sober. Webb stood. "Stay here," he said, and went to intercept Mark before he could reach the office. But Mark was already pushing past 4 men behind him. All of them reeked of whiskey despite the early hour. Mark himself was a big man running to fat now, but still dangerous. His face was flushed red and his eyes were mean. "Well, well," Mark said when he saw them. "Heard a rumor, couldn't believe it, but here you are, Bridger, sitting down to tea with a squaw like she's people." Will stood slowly. "That's my future wife you're talking about, Mark. I'd suggest you choose your next words carefully." "Your wife?" Mark laughed a nasty sound. "You gone senile, old man? She's Indian, probably the same one who killed 3 of my boys last week." "Your boys attacked her," Will said. "She defended herself. That's murder in my book. Your book is written in whiskey and hate. Doesn't count for much." Mark's face darkened. He took a step toward Will, but Reverend Webb moved between them. "This is a church, Marcus," Webb said firmly. "You'll show respect or you'll leave." "Respect," Mark spat the word. "For an Indian, they're animals, Webb. You should know that better than anyone. Didn't your brother die at Little Bighorn?" "My brother died in a war," Webb said quietly. "That doesn't give me the right to hate every person with darker skin than mine." "It should," Mark said. He pointed at Aita. "That woman killed 3 white men. She should hang." Aita stood. Will moved to intercept her, but she put a hand on his arm, stopping him. She faced Mark